Recently, 5th edition D&D has garnered a bit of criticism because of the quote-unquote power creep of its newer products. Options like Tasha's Mind Whip and Silvery Barbs have led to a lot of trendy videos about whether or not it's healthy to remove certain options from the game. And let me be clear, as more and more options become available to players for building their character, I think it's worth at least some consideration from DMs to make judgment calls about whether or not it's worth banning certain options from their table. Hi, I'm John from Incendium D&D, and for today's video, we're going to be talking about the one spell that I banned from my table. Sort of. Now, before banning a spell or option from your table, I do think that it's worth careful consideration about why you're banning it. I've heard a lot of content creators from D&D Tube explain their reasoning, and one thing that I find really interesting is a lot of them pick different one spells that they ban from their table, but their reasoning for why they banned it is pretty much the same. For example, Treant Monk did a video on banning Shield, and Cody from Taking 20 more recently posted a video about why he banned Tasha's Mind Whip. And don't even get me started on Silvery Barbs. When that spell first came out, my feed was flooded with videos on whether or not it was worth banning. Again, each of these creators pretty much ban these options for the same reason. Usually something gets banned because it's an option that's so good that it reduces the total number of viable options for the table. Let's take Shield as an example. In his video, Treant Monk dives into how a lot of players intentionally build and multi-class their characters so they get access to the Shield spell. Because of this, running encounters as is, a lot of times the combats would become very boring because it felt impossible to hit players. And there is some solid math to back up this claim. But because of this, what Treant Monk describes is he started having to build encounters with Shield in mind, meaning that attack bonuses were a lot greater than they usually are. And because of that, if a player brought a character that didn't have the Shield spell, well, they were actually extra likely to get hit. It's an example of how one option being so good virtually excludes any character build that doesn't have that option as part of it. And like I said before, I find that a lot of these ban hammer videos end up coming from the same place. Some option, whether it's a particularly powerful subclass or a spell or a feat, becomes so powerful at a table that every player feels like they need it. Without banning such options, a lot of times what happens is you'll just see more and more the same builds brought to the table. And because there's little choice in what happens, eventually play begins to grow stale. Now, fortunately, this type of frustration is one I've managed to avoid at my table. I'm not saying that it'll never happen, or I have some genius design that I use that prevents it, or that these content creators should just get good at designing encounters. Honestly, I think I've just been fortunate with the kind of play my players are looking for. And I wanted to take some time to highlight this reasoning because I think it's perfectly good. It's a good reason to ban an option. However, the case I'm about to bring up comes from a different place. The one spell I've ever banned from my table is Conjure Animals, and Conjure Woodland Beings, and Conjure Minor Elementals, and pretty much all the conjure spells. Really, any of these conjure spells that allow you to summon either one creature or 2 or 4 or 8. And really, it's because I prefer the summon series of spells that was released in Tasha's Cauldron. And this is one case where I actually find that the newer spells aren't more powerful, they're just more streamlined. And even though these are newer spells, they're not flashy like Mind Whip or Silvery Barbs. No. These unbalanced abominations come straight from the player's handbook. Let's pick on Conjure Animals first. I'll read the text and then get into complaining a bit. So it says, you summon fey spirits that take the form of beasts and appear in an unoccupied space that you can see within range. Choose one of the following options for what appears. a beast of challenge rating 2 or lower, 2 beasts of challenge rating 1 or lower, 4 beasts of challenge rating half or lower, 8 beasts of challenge rating quarter or lower. Each beast is also considered a Fey, and it disappears when it drops to 0 hit points or when the spell ends. Oh, what's kind of interesting here is actually, it says each beast is also considered Fey. I wonder if this would be considered the dual creature type tag. Like, we saw that a little bit in Unearthed Arcana recently. Roll initiative for the summoned creatures as a group, which has its own turns. They obey any verbal commands that you issue to them, no action required by you. If you don't issue any commands to them, they defend themselves from hostile creatures but otherwise take no actions. The DM has the creature's statistics. When you cast a spell using certain higher level spell slots, you choose one of the summoning options above and more creatures appear. Twice as many with a 5th level slot, 3 times as many with a 7th level slot, and 4 times as many with a 9th level slot. Bahamut help me. Now, one question that gets asked a lot is, does the DM or the player choose which creatures end up getting summoned? Thankfully, this is a time that Sage Advice actually has an answer to our question. Sage Advice, if you don't know, is a compendium of rules clarifications and answers to frequently asked questions that you can find through a simple Google search. It says, a number of spells in the game let you summon creatures. Conjure animals, conjure celestial, conjure minor elementals, and conjure woodland beings are just a few examples. Some spells of this sort specify that the spellcaster chooses the creature conjured. For example, Find Familiar gives the caster a list of animals to choose from. Other spells of this sort let the spellcaster choose from among several broad options. For example, Conjure Minor Elementals offers 4 options. Here are the first 2. 1 elemental with a challenge rating 2 or lower, 2 elementals with a challenge rating 1 or lower. The design intent for options like these is that the spellcaster chooses one of them, and then the DM decides what creatures appear that fit the chosen option. For example, if you pick the second option, the DM chooses the 2 elementals that have a challenge rating of 1 or lower. A spellcaster can certainly express a preference for what creatures show up, but it's up to the DM to determine if they do. The DM will often choose creatures that are appropriate for the campaign and that will be fun to introduce in a scene. Yeah, fun, quote unquote. Now, D&D combat is more often a game of each participant's action economy rather than the exchange of values like damage or healing. So, of course, the 2 times I've allowed this spell to go off, both times the players chose to have 8 creatures challenge rating 1/4 or lower. First, where am I supposed to put all of them? I DM using a battle grid and tokens. So all of a sudden, there are 8 new tokens that have to be put on the board? Roll initiative for the summoned creatures as a group, which has its own turns. They obey any verbal commands that you issue to them, no action required by you. Beyond the logistical complications of finding the space and positioning for 8 new creatures, which can be large, that like riding horses are large CR 1/4 beasts, this is really the one that gets me. All of a sudden, with a single 3rd level spell, a spellcaster now has 9 times the attack rolls to keep track of, 9 times the movement to keep track of, and 9 times the hit points to keep track of. On top of the complication that being a spellcaster already demands. Put that next to a fighter or a barbarian. I rolled a hit twice. The few times I've actually seen this spell go off in play, every time it overcomplicates and bogs down the encounter. Because now a player takes 9 times, at minimum 9 times as long to take their turn. And honestly, it's usually way more than that because they're still like flitting around trying to find the exact perfect spell for their turn. And worse, in my experience, it doesn't make the encounter better. Sure, you get more attack rolls, you might be doing more damage, but you're also making every other player wait at least 9 times as long for them to do their turn. So even if theoretically it adds this great advantage to the party's side during combat, which in my experience it doesn't, still, you're really taking a lot of game time away from the other players. It's not necessarily a powerful option, it's just an overcomplicated option. By comparison, I find the summon series of spells from Tasha's to be a lot more streamlined. For one, they only add a single unit, a single extra token to the combat. Second, and this is another big one, it's not up to the DM to somehow provide a stat block for the players to use. Just the logistics of this alone. Again, let's pretend we're back in like 2017. We haven't gotten, all the monster cards or anything like that. And a lot of times at a game table, really the DM has the player's handbook and the monster manual. A lot of other players don't necessarily have all of these books. So the DM is constantly like trying to give the player like the monster manual for the stat of whatever abomination they summoned, while also trying to keep track of their own monsters. It's a huge just mess. Whereas if a player selected an option from Tasha's, theoretically they have Tasha's, they have their own book with a stat block ready for them, and it's their responsibility to do all the little calculations that are involved with it. The stats for the summoned creature are explicit, consistent, and reliable, so it makes for a more useful spell. And in my experience, having seen these summoned creatures used at a table, having used these summoned creatures myself, their features and attacks are actually worth it. I banned the Conjure series of spells from my table, not because they were a more powerful option, because all they did was bog down play. So at the beginning of this video, I said that I banned these spells, sort of. So where does the sort of come in? Well, in my experience, these spells really bog down the game when used in combat. Meaning that if a player wanted to have these spells prepared for some kind of utility, I'd probably let them, as long as they talk to me about it ahead of time. For example, I could see some kind of situation where the party druid expends a 3rd level spell slot in order to conjure a bunch of riding horses, so that players could have an easier time during exploration or overland travel. But the horses would not be involved in combat, or get their own initiative count or anything like that. And as a random aside, the other thing that, looking back on it, I didn't realize I did, but it's actually really helpful, is I actually created my world with lore that would make the banning of certain spells make a lot more sense. For example, with the Conjure series of spells, you're supposed to be conjuring these creatures from another plane. Even conjure animals, these are fey spirits that take the shape of beasts. Well, one of the things I'm playing with in my current home game is the idea that there isn't like a multiverse. There aren't extra planes. There's just the material plane. So there isn't a real good reason why players can conjure these fey spirits. Of course, there's a lot that I'm playing with and the world may be reshaped later on, but as of right now, even though I explicitly banned the Conjure series, there's also a lore reason that supports it. Another really good example are spells like Animate Dead. Other spells that allow one player to suddenly multiply their action economy. Now, the first reason I've never had to deal with Animate Dead is simply because I've never had a player interested in diving into necromancy. Not that I'm asking for it, I'm not, but in this setting's lore for my home game, the creation of undead is a crime punishable by death. Meaning that a player that would choose to create a necromancer character has a lot of added narrative stress to choosing that option. Because at any time they're caught using this forbidden magic, the setting's law enforcement could come up and execute them on sight. So even if they chose this kind of like theoretically high reward option, it's also a high risk option. They need to be very careful when they use it. They can't just spam it every fight. Mind magic, like Charming and Mind Whip, fall into a similar category. To go to Cody's example of Tasha's Mind Whip breaking encounters, I actually find that there's a lot of times players don't use it at my tables. Not because it's not a strong combat option, but because they now have to consider if that option is worth the narrative complications after the combat. Now, I'm not saying this is how every game should be run. This is a testimony to something that has worked at my home table, and one that you may be interested in playing or experimenting with at yours. In conclusion, conjure spells rules as written in a combat application, banned from my table. Some other options have been quote-unquote soft banned because of the narrative consequences of their use. But players are always welcome to lower the difficulty of combat by increasing the difficulty of social interaction. So now I'm curious what all of you think. Are there any spells or other kind of options that you've outright banned at your table? If so, what was the result you found afterwards? Let me know in the comments down below. If you liked this video, make sure to let YouTube know. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, ring the notification bell, and have an awesome day, everyone. Bye-bye now.